Okay, Mark, picking back up, just quick reminder where we are. Mark in chapter 14, verses 22 to 26, he reports the institution of the Lord's Supper. Now this is Thursday night, which is of course the beginning of the Jewish Friday. It's the day of Passover. And Jesus tells them solemnly in 14:25 that he won't drink again of the fruit of the vine, meaning share in this supper that he's instituted. He won't do that until when he drinks it new in the kingdom of God. And then in 14:26, Jesus and the disciples, they sing a hymn, and then they head out to the Mount of Olives. And that's where the Garden of Gethsemane is located. It's on the Mount of Olives. And then in 14:27 to 31, he predicts Peter's denial. And then in 32 to 42 of chapter 14, the group enters the Garden of Gethsemane that's on the Mount of Olives. And Jesus takes with him Peter, James, and John, and he takes them to a spot some distance from the others. So they all enter. Jesus then takes Peter, James, and John, retreats from the group some distance away, and he tells the three, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And then he leaves the three, and he goes deeper into the garden by himself, where he falls down and pours out his heart to God the Father, expressing his desire to avoid the path of the cross that's set before him, if that be in any way possible. He's simply pouring his heart out to his Father, but he immediately asserts his unswerving commitment to obeying the Father's will, declaring, "Yet not what I will, but what you will." Let's pick back up in verse 37 of chapter 14. Jesus returns from praying, just pouring his heart out, and he finds the three sleeping. And he says to Peter in verse 37, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour?" And he may have singled Peter out. They're all sleeping. But he may have singled Peter out because of his insistence in verses 29 through 31 that he'd never deny him. And he then tells all three of them to watch and pray, to remain alert and tuned into the battle, and to pray for divine enablement so that they not succumb to temptation. You see, it's a war. Spiritual life is a war. And if you cannot be complacent about it. We can't afford to be casual about it, as though it's not a war. And that's what Jesus is telling them. And part of the reality of that battle is the weakness or limitation of our present human body. You see, one's spirit, one's desire or will may be for one thing, but the weakness of the present body can work against implementation of that desire, as their physical and emotional exhaustion, in this case, worked against their keeping watch with the Lord. I mean, it's late now. They had the Passover. It's Thursday night. They had that meal. They're out here now. It's getting late. And so Jesus is telling them, stay tuned in. Be with me. Watch with me. Be part of what I'm going through. You see? And so he tells them that this is a war, and you need to pray for divine enablement. Then in 39 and 40, Jesus again goes and prays the same thing. And when he returns, he again finds Peter, James, and John sleeping. And you think about, well, how is that possible? Well, I don't know about you, but I will say anybody who has ever taught has seen this. Well, what's going on? Well, sometimes you just get beat. Sometimes somebody's tired. And so you know how it is. You're trying and well, so he comes back and they're asleep, and they're ashamed or embarrassed, you see, as indicated by the fact they didn't know what to say to him. They didn't have any excuses. He comes back and says, "You sleeping again?" And they just, there's nothing they can say. And then he goes in 41 to 42, the scene plays out a third time. And Jesus returns only to find them still sleeping, and he declares, enough of that. Now there's a translation issue how you render that. But he says enough of that, meaning the situation is now changing. That sleeping is no longer an option. You see, the time for the Son of Man's betrayal has arrived, and he tells them to rise and go. The betrayer's now present. So he's out struggling here right as his arrest is imminent. And they're sleeping. He says, okay, something's happened now. There's a change in the situation. The betrayer is now here. And then in 43 to 52, as he's speaking, Judas appears with an armed mob from the Jewish leadership, from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now, John, in his gospel, he suggests that Roman soldiers also were present. You wouldn't see that in the synoptics. But in John, he implies that there are Roman soldiers present. John says in John 18:3 that Judas brought the speiron, so he brought the speiron, and he brought officers or servants of the chief priest and the Pharisees. And then in John 18:12, he says that the speira and the kiliarchos and the officers, servants of the Jews took Jesus. Now this word speira, this is a technical term. It's a technical term for part of a Roman legion. And it has that meaning in all of its New Testament occurrences. And the term it was rarely applied outside of the New Testament to Jews, but when it was, as Andrew Lincoln says, when it was rarely applied in other literature to Jews, he says in other literature, it was with reference to the troops of a local sovereign or a leader of a revolt, and never has in view the retinue at the disposal of the Sanhedrin or chief priests, from which it is in any case clearly distinguished in John. So you see that he comes with a Roman group of soldiers, and he also brings the Jewish soldiers. Let me read you several quotes from Leon Morris's commentary on John, then I'll get off this. I say this because this question comes up sometimes about where in the world do people get the idea there were any Romans there? And this is where it comes from. Leon Morris says, a cohort was the 10th part of a legion, and thus normally, he says compromise, that's a typo or just a mistake. He means comprised 600 men. In practice, the number varied a good deal. It was commanded by a kiliarchos. John will not, of course, mean that 600 or so soldiers took part in the arrest, but that the cohort performed the task. In other words, a detachment was sent. Some point out that speira was used on occasion of a maniple, which was 1/3 of a cohort, that is 200 men, but even this is rather large. John is surely not saying that the whole speira was present, but rather using a form of speech like the police came to arrest the man. Yet we must bear in mind that the Romans could use surprisingly large numbers of soldiers where one prisoner was in question, Acts 23:23, and that here they may well have feared a riot. So you don't know how many soldiers there were. Wherever they are, they're coming from a speira, but you don't know how many are actually sent. Morris says, he says, some commentators hold that there could not have been Romans in the posse. That's kind of why I'm spending a little time on this. He says, but Newbigin finds it, quote, not very surprising in view of the evidence of good relations between Caiaphas and Pilate, and in view of constant Roman anxiety about outbreaks of violence at the great festivals, end quote. It is likely that the Jewish authorities would have brought in the Romans as soon as possible in view of their ultimate aim, which is to have Jesus killed, which they're going to have to bring the Romans in for that anyway. He says, in view of their ultimate aim, and we might add, in view of the fact that on a previous occasion the temple guards had failed to arrest Jesus. With passions running high at the festival period, the Romans would be unlikely to refuse a request for help from the high priest. They would always have to reckon with the possibility that Jesus and the 11 would resist arrest and that a host of excited Galileans might join them. So he's just saying that it's not crazy to think that the Romans would go along with a request, because if you say, hey, we're going out to get this guy, they may be thinking, okay, you'd like us to be there. We'll be there as backup because we don't want anything to get out of control. Lastly, Morris says, Robinson points out that all the synopses say that Jesus asked, do you take me for a bandit, a lestes? And he proceeds, now if we ask whom we should expect to arrest such a terrorist or freedom fighter, there can only be one answer. And he proceeds to ask who arrested Barabbas, whom John calls a lestes. It's no marvel that the Jews were able to enlist the aid of the Romans in arresting Jesus. So it's there by implication, I think, that they had Roman authorities there backing up their attempt here to arrest Jesus. Now Judas, he told the authorities with him that he would point Jesus out to them by greeting him with a kiss so they would know the right guy to arrest. I mean, they're here and they don't know exactly who is this guy Jesus. They don't have that. They want to go and jump on the wrong guy and have Jesus get away. So that's part of his thing. They say, okay, not only can he give us Jesus at a time when we can arrest him more discreetly, when he's off privately at night, but he can also serve to give us concrete identification. Now, John, in John's gospel, he includes a fuller description of the encounter, okay, which has Jesus identifying himself twice, and includes at least the Jewish authorities shrinking back and falling down when he first does so. You remember he says, I'm the guy, and whoa. You see, so John has this fuller description of the encounter. Now, I assume that what happened is that Jesus' assertiveness, when they come out to arrest him, and they figure, he's going to be ducking and all this stuff. No. He just comes out and says, you looking for me? So that, I think, throws a little kink into the plan. They thought that he would be he would be hiding or something, but his assertiveness caused some confusion in the plan. See, Judas may initially have felt that Jesus identifying himself made his doing so with a kiss unnecessary. So he may have hung back and hesitated, but when the authorities hesitated with the Jews falling back, then Judas says, okay, maybe I do need to give him a kiss for solid confirmation. So he then proceeds straight to the Lord and kisses him, and when he does so, that's when they arrest him. So they've got concrete ID. A guy who knows him intimately has just fingered him, because they're thinking, this guy who's out here claiming to be Jesus, how do we know that? You see, maybe this is a ruse. Maybe this is a diversionary tactic. And so when he kisses him, they all come and grab him. Now, all four of the Gospels report that at that time, one of the disciples cut off the ear of a high priest's servant. They all say that. Now, Luke specifies it was the right ear. And he adds that Jesus healed the servant's ear. John also notes that it was the right ear. And he adds that the one who cut it off was Peter, and he gives us the name of the high priest's servant as Malchus. Now, one is left to speculate about how the situation was contained after that assault. Right? I mean, here they are out here. You've got these Jewish soldiers, and you've got presumably this Roman backup. And they're coming to arrest him, and somebody goes physical with a sword. Now, you could see this thing getting out of hand, so you have to speculate, well, what happened? That we didn't have all-out bloodshed. Well, presumably, the Lord's immediate intervention and healing diffused the situation. When he jumps in immediately and says, put away your sword, and then immediately heals him and lets him know, we're not having a problem like that. You see, plus maybe the respect that they had or fear of at least the Jews of his power. Well, maybe that was enough to diffuse the situation. He said, okay, we're not going that route. All right, so they said, okay, if you're going to go ahead and give yourself up, well then fine. Now Jesus challenges their action. He challenges their coming to arrest him with swords and clubs, like he was an outlaw or an insurrectionist, and doing so at night, when they could have arrested him at any time during the day when he was teaching in the temple courts. And the implication of that challenge by Jesus is that they're doing it secretly because he's not an outlaw or an insurrectionist. If I was, you wouldn't need to do it secretly. Everybody would cheer that you were in fact capturing a bad guy. But the very fact you got to do it on the sly is an indication, see, that you know that I'm not really the person that you're claiming me to be. Not somebody deserving this kind of treatment. But he notes that this is all happening in fulfillment of Scripture. God is striking the shepherd through the culpable conduct of the rebels. He's incorporating that rebellion into his purpose. So God is doing it, but how is he doing it? He's doing it through the rebellion of these people. And so he says Scripture will be fulfilled. And as Jesus predicted, all the disciples, they flee when he's taken. Now you think about that and say, well, they're just, all out cowards. Well, it just seems to me that they don't want to get captured, but it seems they were willing, at least Peter was willing to fight, but now the Lord says, don't fight. And so their choice is get hauled in. So in light of that, they say, well, no, we're not doing that. But they do flee. You see, all of them wind up fleeing. And only Mark notes the presence of a young man who had only a linen garment wrapped around his body. Mark's the only one who reports this. And in the ensuing chaos, the young man was grabbed. Okay, but he then takes off. He runs away naked. See, leaving the garment in his would-be captor's hands. And the fact only Mark reports that makes you think, well, was this young man John Mark? You see, is this the author of the Gospel of Mark? That's quite possible. But of course it can't be demonstrated. 15 in verses 53 to 65. Now Mark, he reports that Jesus is taken. So they've come and they've arrested him now. We're late in the night, maybe early morning, by our time, after midnight. But Mark reports that Jesus is taken to the high priest, who at that time the high priest is Caiaphas. And you can see that in Matthew 26, 3:57, John 11:49. Now Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas. And you see that's in John 18:3. Annas had served as high priest until he was deposed, removed from being high priest by the Romans in AD 15. And Annas, who had 5 sons and a son-in-law, serve as high priest, he was still very influential. As you can imagine, he'd been taken out by the Romans. Okay? So he was still very influential, as indicated by the fact Luke refers to him in Luke chapter 3, verse 2, as a kind of de facto co-high priest with Caiaphas. And the fact John reports that Jesus initially appeared before Annas before he was taken to Caiaphas. You see that in John 18. He seems to have been like a godfather kind of figure. Not officially high priest, but very influential in that circle. So that seems to be how he is. Now, in 1994, some of you may remember from the class on archaeology, in 1994, the archaeologists Lean and Kathleen Rittmeyer, they made a strong case that the first century burial tombs just south of the Temple Mount, near the junction of the Hinnom and Kidron valleys, in an area popularly known as the Keldama, that this area includes the tomb of Annas, the high priest. And here is what that tomb looks like today. Now, there are no identifying inscriptions there, but it's not a poor person's burial ground. How do they get to this conclusion? And here's what they say, the three reasons that lead them to this. They say the tombs of Akeldama, this region, are too elaborate to have been anything but burial places for Jerusalem's prominent citizens. So they can just look at it and see, in terms of first century stuff, this looks like who's here? Like we can go to a neighborhood and say, who's here is somebody who's not, poor. Well, that's what he's looking at here. He says, but burial places for Jerusalem's prominent citizens, their decoration of these tombs in this region echoes that of the Temple Mount. Okay, so this is where priests hang out and what they do, and so the decorations reflect the connection to the Temple Mount, which reinforces that the tomb is in fact of one of the priestly families. And he says Josephus places the tomb of Annas in the area of Akeldama. The first century Jewish historian Josephus reports that. So they put these things together and they say that we think this is in fact the tomb of Annas, and a number of people, here's a reconstruction of it. You see, what you see there is just the dark part. That's what's left, and this is how they think that it was. It was like that. So whether that's as with so many things in archaeology, you just have to say what's the most reasonable thing, and that's many people are convinced that they have in fact found Annas' tomb. Now in 1990, there was this ornate ossuary. Now an ossuary is a bone box. And the way they buried people, there was a brief window of time, maybe a century, when the burial practice in Palestine is you would put somebody in a tomb, you would let the flesh rot off, and then you would collect the bones and put the bones in an ossuary, a bone box. And so here in 1990, this ornate ossuary was discovered in Peace Forest, south of the Temple Mount, by workers who were building a water park. So, they're excavating and they discover this. It dates to the first century, and it has two inscriptions on it. One is in Aramaic, one is in Hebrew, which may be that in the inscriptions may be translated Caiaphas, and the other Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Now, Josephus, the Jewish historian, he gives Caiaphas's full name as Joseph, who is called Caiaphas of the high priesthood. So you see that connection there. Now inside the ossuary there were the bones of 6 people, including the bones of a 60-year-old man, and many scholars are convinced that this is indeed the ossuary of Caiaphas, the high priest. In fact, John Reed and Dominic Crossan, certainly no conservatives. Okay, they say there should be no doubt that the chamber was the resting place of the family of the high priest Caiaphas, named in the Gospels for his role in the crucifixion, and it's very likely that the elderly man's bones were those of Caiaphas himself. Okay, now everybody doesn't agree. There are those who think that Caiaphas is not the correct translation of the inscriptions. Okay, so you need to be aware of that. But many are convinced that this is in fact the ossuary of Caiaphas. Now, the members of the governing body, known as the Sanhedrin, who came from the ruling priests, the scribes, and the elders, they gathered at Caiaphas' residence. And after having abandoned Jesus, Peter doubles back and he follows the crowd at a distance. And he ends up in the high priest's courtyard. He ends up in the courtyard sitting with officials of some kind and warming himself by the fire. And Jesus was taken to an upper room. Now you can see he was taken to an upper room because in 1466 it refers to the courtyard below. So Jesus is taken to an upper room. Peter's here in the courtyard sitting by the fire warming himself. And the high priest and the Sanhedrin, they're trying to frame Jesus for a capital offense. This is terrible. Right? They're trying to frame him as cover to just kill him. They don't want to just come and kill him and everybody see you just murdered him. So they want to dress their murder in judicial legitimacy. That's what they're doing. So they're trying to frame him, but they don't have the evidence to do it. The people they had arranged to testify against Jesus, you remember, it's the middle of the night. And the people they were able to pull together to testify against him, they did so falsely. And as often happens when that's the case, they contradicted one another. You see, they're not telling the truth, so you wind up having these things that don't fit. And that's what happened here. The only specific charge that Mark mentions is that Jesus said he would destroy the temple. But as Mark notes, that was false. Jesus never claimed he would destroy the temple. He never said that. He only predicted its destruction. See, which presumably is the source of the disagreement in their testimony. You got somebody say, no, he said he was going to do this. He was going to come. Other guy said, no, he didn't say that. Uh-oh. Guys are going, you people are too stupid. You know, we're hiring stooges to come and frame this guy, and they can't even do it correctly. So they're upset. So Caiaphas jumps in. He jumps in to salvage the operation. He sees it's going south. And they're not going to have the cover they need. So he jumps in to salvage the operation, and he asks Jesus to defend himself against the charges. But Jesus remains silent. Like Isaiah 53:7. He jumps in, demands he defends the charges, and then he asks Jesus directly if he is the Messiah. And he adds the Son of the Blessed One. And he says that because it was understood from texts like Psalm chapter 2, verse 7, Psalm 89:26, that the Messiah, the ultimate Davidic king, that he would be the Son of God in an ultimate or special sense. You see, as Solomon, David's son, was king and was Son of God in a lesser sense, as you see in 2 Samuel 7:14. Now, of course, Mark's readers would see all of the full ramifications of that statement where he says, the Son of the Blessed One. They would see all of that. Now, Jesus answers directly that he is the Messiah. He says, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Yes, I am. Now, Matthew reports the response in Matthew chapter 26, verse 64. He reports the response as, you have said so. Okay, Mark says, he says, I am. Matthew says, he says, you have said so. See, but you have said so, that serves as an affirmative answer, you see. That's a yes. It's a yes, while at the same time it carries a nuance to it. Yes, I am, but in a sense that is beyond or not exactly what you envision in your question. So it's not no, it's yes, but there's a little more to the story, that you have some misapprehension or misconception of what that means. So it's yes, I am the Messiah, but you have misconceptions about what that means. Now, the Spirit didn't deem that particular nuance, that there were misconceptions about their understanding of the Messiah. He didn't consider that particular nuance relevant for Mark's audience, so Mark simply gives, I am. Okay? That's what Jesus said. He said, I am. Yes, I am the Messiah. And Mark reports that. Now, Jesus tells the Sanhedrin, he's speaking to the group, the you is plural. He tells the group, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, though they are about to condemn him, they will soon see him in a different light. You see, as the present turning point, as this plays out in his crucifixion and his resurrection, they will see him exalted to God's right hand, and that they will see things indicative of that exaltation, even if they don't fully grasp what they're seeing. They are going to see that, even if they don't grasp what they're seeing. They will see the 3-hour darkness over all the land. They will see the tearing of the temple curtain. They will see the earthquake. They will see the empty tomb. They will see dead saints raised to life. Which events, all of those events were sufficient to draw the conclusion from the centurion that this man's the Son of God. Okay, so they're going to see they're thinking, we're just going to kill this guy who's a loudmouth and he's causing us trouble. They're going to see the indicators of his exaltation that they were in fact wrong. They were wrong about who he is. And they will see the preaching and the powerful works and the changed lives of his disciples. All of that they will see. And beyond that, and tied to his exalted status, they will also see the parousia, the return of the Lord Jesus to judge those who had unjustly judged him. They will see that. Darrell Bock says his coming with the clouds of heaven is an allusion to Daniel chapter 7 verses 13 and 14 and the judging authority that figure receives from the Ancient of Days. It looks to his return to judge. As you see in Mark chapter 13 verse 26. Many others understand this. Cranfield and Lane and Gundry and Evans and Stein and Marcus and Strauss, all commentators on Mark. So they will see that. Now the fact they will have long been dead when that occurs doesn't mean they won't see it. Right? As mankind, living and dead, will bear witness. All of mankind. Isn't that right? All of mankind will bear witness to that event, in that all of mankind will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. That's what he says in Matthew 25, 31 to 46, Romans 14:10, 2 Timothy 4:1. At his return, every knee will bow in honor of his name, and every tongue will confess openly that he is Lord. That's Philippians 2, 9 to 11. Some will do so grudgingly because they are overpowered. Others will do so joyfully. But every tongue's confessing that Jesus is Lord when he returns. Moreover, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16 suggests the possibility that even before they're resurrected from the dead, they'll be able to see what's transpiring beyond their lot in Hades. You see, so every tongue's going to confess. They will see him. They will see his exaltation. And they're going to see him coming as judge. Here's what Mark Strauss says. Brown, he's referring to Raymond Brown, a famous work of his, the death of the Messiah. He says, Brown is no doubt right that here we have a representative role for the Sanhedrin. All who oppose or affirm Jesus will one day see his vindication. Revelation chapter 1 verse 7, which combines Daniel 7:13 and Zechariah 12:10, sums it up. Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all peoples on earth will mourn because of him. You see, this is what Jesus is telling them. At this, they think that they're in control. They think that they are here and going to get rid of a problem, and he is telling them there is more going on here than you have any clue about. And you are going to see, as this plays out in his crucifixion and resurrection, who he is. And you will see him coming again. All will see him coming again. Now Caiaphas, when Jesus tells him this, Caiaphas in outrage or as a formal judicial act. We can't know. The Mishnah, which is later, has this tearing of your robe as a formal judicial act, as a judgment of blasphemy. But we can't be sure that that was already in place here. So whether it's just an outrage or whether it's already a formal judicial act judging blasphemy, he rips his garment and he calls for a verdict of blasphemy based on what the Lord had said, which he perceived to be sufficiently disrespectful of God and insulting to God's chosen leaders to qualify as blasphemy. So he says, that's it. See, he intervened because things were going south. He drew out enough, he thought, that he could now charge him with blasphemy and we can, quote, legally get rid of him. I've done what I intended to do. And the Sanhedrin judged him guilty and deserving of death. And when it says all the Sanhedrin, it could just mean a consensus and over. It could be hyperbolic, saying that virtually all of them were in on this. Or it could be literal. But he says that, that the Sanhedrin, they judge him guilty, deserving of death. And as Jesus had prophesied in chapter 10, verses 33 to 34, some of them began spitting on. This is Jesus. This is God incarnate. They began spitting on and beating him and mocking him, calling him to prophesy. Oh, come on, man. Oh, come on, big guy. Why don't you prophesy? Who's in control now? You think you are. You see, you think you are. But what God is this who will endure this from the people who have rebelled against him in order to save them? That's why when people talk about, God, why is God this and that? He's not loving, he's evil. I say, you have no idea who God is. If you can't understand the depth of his love and that's his nature, well, then you've really completely missed the boat. Well, the temple police, they took him and they also beat him, which could refer to beating him with an object like a whip or a club. They're beating him that way. And in 66 to 72 of chapter 14, while Jesus is upstairs, he's being subjected to this charade trial, this joke trial. Peter's in the courtyard below. He's warming himself by the fire, and a servant girl recognized him as one of Jesus' followers. And Peter tells her he has no idea what she's talking about. And he goes out into the entryway just inside the gate. See, perhaps positioning himself if he needs to get away. So he goes out here near the gateway in case he's going to have to book. Possibly that's what's motivating his move there. Now the statement, by the way, is a little footnote at the end of 68. And the rooster crowed. It's textually suspect, okay? That's why it's omitted from a number of English translations. Yours may not have that clause in it. Now the servant girl, she sees Peter relocate. And she gets loud on him. You see, she gets loud on him to those who are standing around, declaring that Peter was one of the Lord's followers. So she's making a stink about this. And Peter again denied it. And before long, you had the bystanders who were there, and they were insisting that he was one of Jesus' followers based on the fact he's a Galilean, which they would have been able to tell because of his accent. So I said, come on, man. Who are you kidding? She's diming you. You're trying to deny it, and I can hear you're a Galilean. It's not looking good for you. So that's what's going on. And at that point, Peter begins to invoke curses and to declare with an oath, I do not know this man of whom you speak. Now, it's not clear against whom the curses are invoked. Okay, it's ambiguous. It's not clear there. He may be invoking a curse on himself. You see, that's how the Revised Standard Version has it. That's how the English Standard Version has it. In other words, they simply assume that's what he's doing, and he's calling this curse down on himself, in which case the meaning is, look, may I be cursed if I'm lying when I say I don't know the man. Okay, that would be the idea. Now, where's the confusion? Well, you would expect that if he's calling a curse down on himself, you would expect somewhere that the reflexive pronoun himself would be there. But it's not. And typically when you have this idea of cursing without that, it's a curse directed to somebody else. So that fact has led a number of scholars to conclude that Mark means Peter was cursing someone or something other than himself. All right, well then who? Okay, who's he cursing? Some of them are persuaded he was cursing Jesus. You see, in order to confirm that he was not a follower. That seems hard for me to swallow. Okay? I mean, it's one thing to succumb to fear and something, but to actually curse the Lord, I'd have to have some really powerful evidence of that. And it's not necessary, because even if you think that Peter wasn't addressing the curse to himself, if he's not doing that, it seems more likely to me that he was cursing his accusers. You see, saying in essence, as Mark Strauss puts it, "Go to hell for making such an accusation against me. I swear to you, I don't know the man." You see, that just, can I say to it's impossible that he'd be doing that with Jesus? No, you have to play that by feel. My feel is that Peter wouldn't say that. Okay? And so it's either, in my judgment, himself, or he's saying, you people who are doing this, you be cursed for having the audacity to challenge me. Okay, so but that's an issue that comes up. Now, right when the rooster crowed the second time, fulfilling the Lord's prediction in 14:30, Peter burst into tears. Right, he just burst into tears. David Garland says, it's ironic that a rooster, renowned for its foolish pride. You know how animals get attached to certain ideas, like an owl is wise, and so this is how roosters are seen, renowned because they're just strutting around. You see, so they got to get attached to this idea. He says, renowned for its foolish pride reminds Peter of Jesus' prediction that he would deny him 3 times. The king of the chicken coop rules the roost and struts around thinking that he's king of the world. The rooster fits perfectly Peter's cocky boastfulness in 14:29, but it is the crowing of the rooster that snaps him to awareness of what he has just done. And that was significant. Peter is a tremendous disciple, right? Peter is, he's just something. You look at Peter and Paul and these people. So the road to get there, right? I heard that bell. This is part of the road to get there, is that he struggled with something, he failed, and yet he was convicted. And you see the life that Peter lived. Peter lives a life from the resurrection on. Hey, we'd say he's the bomb. Peter and Paul, serious disciples of Christ. But here, he learned a lesson. And that crying, when somebody's crying like that, that's conviction. That's conviction, and that changes people. And I think this was a blessing in Peter's life. Pick up next week, Lord willing, in chapter 15. Thanks for coming.